rate of decline in phosphocreatine, so you don't need to rely as much on phosphocreatine degradation to support a given power output in a given ATP production when there's more oxygen. But you need to rely on it more when there's less. And if you look at inorganic phosphate accumulation, so here you can see at a given power output, look at the look at the differences in phosphocreatine degradation. 75%, about 65%, 50%. So the muscle in the reduced oxygen delivery state has to rely much more on phosphocreatine degradation to support that given power output in ATP demand. And if you look at the inorganic phosphate accumulation, again at the same power output, you can see that it rose in the hyperoxic or high oxygen delivery condition by about 250%, 300% the norm oxygen condition, but about 425% in the reduced oxygen delivery condition. So there is a much more exaggerated rate of accumulation of fatigue-causing metabolites when you compromise oxygen delivery. And you get a reduction in the rate of accumulation of those metabolites when you increase oxygen delivery. The amazing thing is, look at the end of exercise. When this muscle, when these subjects on average say they cannot continue to do plantar flexion exercise anymore, the metabolic state of the muscle is the same. They're not significantly different. The extent to which phosphocreatine levels have decreased and the extent to which inorganic phosphate levels have increased are very, very similar. So this is telling you something really, really cool about muscle physiology. The muscle will stop contracting well once you've hit a critical threshold of metabolites. How long it takes to reach that threshold is going to be dictated by how well you can supply oxygen to the muscle and how much oxygen you can maintain in that intracellular space. So manipulations in muscle blood flow and adjustments to muscle blood flow are incredibly important to maintain oxygen delivery and prevent the rate of accumulation of fatigue-causing metabolites. Similarly, integrity of your lung-blood interface to make sure that you can basically re-oxygenate the arterial blood becomes very, very important. Because remember, at a given muscle blood flow, if you decrease arterial oxygen content because of hypoxemia, you have to increase the rate of accumulation of fatigue-causing metabolites to support a given power. So you begin to see the implications of disease here. You got a factor that compromises muscle blood flow but doesn't compromise oxygen content, compromise muscle function. You have a disease that compromises lung perfusion and oxygenation, reoxygenation of the blood, but no compromisation of muscle blood flow, compromisation of muscle function. If you've got a condition like congestive heart failure or COPD where both of these factors are being compromised, you've got a real problem. You can't walk upstairs. So, muscle oxygenation determines how much phosphocreatine and inorganic phosphate must change in order to achieve any given rate of oxygen consumption or any given power output. Indeed, if you look at the time to exhaustion was pretty dramatically compromised in the reduced oxygen delivery state and substantially improved in the high oxygen delivery state. So compared to normoxia, the power output achieved and therefore the time to exhaustion, i.e. human exercise performance, was reduced with hypoxia and increased with hyperoxia. But importantly, exhaustion occurred at different times, at different power outputs, but at the same muscle metabolic state across the different FiO2 trials. So the extent to which there was a metabolic disturbance of the muscle was very, very similar. The amount of oxygen delivered to the cell just determined how long it took to hit that threshold. Okay? So, to summarize this in the context of this model again, at a given ATP demand, so now, this is not, again, this is very important, in contrast to the oxygen conformer hypothesis, now at a given ATP demand and a given force output, not at a constant motor drop, because when we exercise voluntarily, we need to maintain a given force output. We need to therefore maintain a given rate of ATP production to support that force output, right? So, during voluntary exercise, If you decrease intracellular PO2 by compromising oxygen delivery, by either decreasing arterial oxygen content and or compromising muscle blood flow, cardiac function, microvascular function, whatever it is, you have to increase motor drive. You got to recruit more motor units. You got to drive that muscle harder. You have to electrically activate the muscle. But that's going to come at the expense of the activation of glycolysis, the breakdown of phosphocreatine, and likely whatever stored ATP exists after the transition from rest to exercise. Now this will result in an increase in the other substrates for oxidative phosphorylation, but also the activation of glycolysis and the accumulation of inorganic phosphate. So in order to support a given ATP demand and force output, you have to recruit more and bigger motor units, but that's at the expense of compromising muscle metabolic state. Okay, so Omar, can you come up here for a second? So the consequences of a change in motor drive are this as well. So face the class, and you'll see it on his facial expression. So hold your arm up. So what I want you to do is I want you to maintain an isometric contraction. Okay? So hold your arm in this position. So now what's going to happen is that I'm going to put, so keep it there, like you work it. All right, so now you're going to keep it there. So now what's going to happen, I'm putting about 10%, say, of my effort on here, okay? So what is your rating of perceived exertion from 0 to 10 right now? 2. Okay, so mild. So now, hold this position. Constant motor drive, okay, as an example. So now if I push down harder, now maybe about 50%. So to do this now, he's now activating, he's now recruiting more motor units to support this given task, right? But you can see there's an effort. The consequences of increasing motor, I'm going to do this until he falls. The consequences of him increasing motor drive is an increasing ratings of perceived exertion. So when muscle oxygen delivery goes down, when intracellular PO2 goes down, then there needs to be a compensation to activate the other metabolic pathways and recruit these motor units. There's a consequence, not only metabolically, but symptomatically. It feels shitty. It sucks. So if you have to really activate your respiratory muscles to support a given ventilation, you perceive shortness of breath. If your muscles begin to get fatigued and accumulate metabolites, you will experience ischemic-like pain and discomfort. And whoever's going to do the experiment this afternoon will certainly experience that. I did it yesterday. Post-exercise, so 40% maximum MVC for 3 minutes, and then 3 minutes of post-exercise circulatory occlusion. Your hand is blue, you're sweaty, it sucks. So, but the point is that what you see is that you have to increase the motor drive to support a given ATP demand, but at the expense of the metabolic state of the muscle. He wouldn't have been able to sustain that. His muscle would have fatigued because he wasn't getting much blood flow, right? He's getting uncomfortable. And so the net effect is that he would have reached a metabolic state where he just couldn't maintain that contraction. Which is what would have happened. That's kind of the evidence that I'm trying to present to you. So the opposite is true. At a constant force output or ATP demand, if you increase intracellular PO2, you can actually get away with reduced motor drive, less exertional symptoms, and actually get away with less of the other substrates, which means that you don't have to break down phosphocreatine as much, accumulate as much inorganic phosphate, and drive glycolysis to the same extent to support a given amount of ATP break, because now you're getting a little bit more through oxidative phosphorylation. So again, this will inhibit glycolysis, delay its activation, and will decrease the rate of inorganic phosphate, will result in more intracellular calcium and delay the onset of fatigue. So, alterations in oxygen delivery evoke changes in intracellular PO2. Oxygen delivery goes up, PCO2 goes up. Oxygen delivery goes down, PCO2 goes down. During voluntary exercise, motor drive can be increased to maintain muscle force production. the nervous system can recruit more and bigger motor units, albeit at the expense of higher ratings of perceived exertion, as we just demonstrated. Granted, his force production went up as I put a greater load on him, but it was, nevertheless, you got the sense of what was happening. Inorganic phosphate directly affects muscle contractile function through the various mechanisms that we talked about. Compromising myofibrocalcium sensitivity, various other factors. So we would like to restrain the extent to which inorganic phosphate accumulates in the muscle. ADP and inorganic phosphate stimulate glycolysis, and we know that an increase in lactic acid production, an increase in stimulation of glycolysis will increase the rate of lactic acid production, where lactic acid itself is not necessarily the determinant of fatigue, but it is certainly a signpost or a physiological marker that there is an impending or an imposing, a forthcoming impairment in muscle metabolic state. If we start dumping out lactate from the muscle, we know that exercise intensity is probably not sustainable for much longer. So, a reduction in intracellular PO2 at any given rate of oxygen consumption or power output, i.e. at any given amount of ATP demand, will result in a greater degradation or breakdown of phosphocreatine and accumulation of inorganic phosphate and ADP in order to maintain oxygen consumption and power output. In order to protect ATP levels. Remember, ATP is a regulated variable, so in the cell, it's constant. The increase in inorganic phosphate serves to compromise sarcoplasmic release of calcium, decrease myofibrocalcium sensitivity, and inhibit cross-bridge formation. Increase in ADP and PI will stimulate glycolysis, resulting in a greater rate of pyruvate production than its conversion to acetyl-CoA by pyruvate dehydrogenase. Again, coming back to my earlier lectures, resulting in increased production of lactic acid and accumulation of the lactate and hydrogen ions. Signposts of basically impending muscle failure, even though they're not necessarily, evidence seems to suggest that they're not directly linked in muscle fatigue, they nevertheless are indicators that fatigue is forthcoming. The increase in inorganic phosphate and to a lesser extent hydrogen ion combine to decrease muscle force production and increase the rate of development of muscle fatigue, resulting in a performance limitation, again, which we defined as the inability of the muscle to support the power output that is required by the task. Once you reach that point where that capacity for the muscle to produce power and the demand for the capacity to produce power intersect, you either have to stop exercising, decrease your power output, right, in order to sustain exercise. Because at that point, the muscle can't support that task any longer. So you either have to do less or stop. Either way, exercise performance is compromised. As the skeletal muscle's fatigue and muscle force generating capacity decreases, neural drive to the contracting muscles must increase. So you must recruit more and larger motor units to support that force output when the muscle becomes fatigued. That's the compensation. But this comes at the expense of symptomatic consequences. You get increase in ratings of perceived exertion, limb discomfort, shortness of breath. If you have peripheral artery disease, for example, and you have an ischemic event in your calf because all of a sudden you've got an occlusive, you have basically an arterial occlusion of, say, your calf muscle. So this does happen in peripheral artery disease. It happens in coronary artery disease. It's basically why you have angina, right? Is that you get to a point where cardiac oxygen requirement is greater than cardiac oxygen delivery. So the heart, an area of the heart will become ischemic, and that ischemia, so those metabolites will activate basically metabolic sensitive nerves, communicate to the brain, and it'll be perceived as pain or discomfort. So we do have an increase in the drive to maintain the power output again. That comes at the expense of increased ratings of perceived exertion. And I think as I talked to you in one of the first lectures, most people don't achieve a maximum VO2. Most people stop exercise because they just can't tolerate the discomfort. There's still a physiological reserve. They can pump a few more beats of their heartbeat. They can ventilate more. They just can't tolerate the discomfort. So, in my world, what I do in my research, ratings of perceived exertion and symptoms of breathlessness and limb discomfort are the primary cause of why people with lung conditions and heart conditions stop exercise. They stop exercise well before they reach a physiological max. So, this has implications for why people would stop. So, it's a lot of information for today, I'm sure, but try to digest it, think about it, review it, and then I'll show you some really cool stuff about cycling time trial studies and things like that next class. Studies done by kind of like I call him the godfather of modern exercise physiology. This guy, Jerry Dempsey, was Wisconsin. He's from Canadian, moved to ran a lab at University of Wisconsin-Madison for many years. He's now an emeritus professor and retired, but he's remarkable. He's pretty remarkable. And you'll see in my classes, you'll see a lot of the stuff that he does, because I think what he's done, no one else did, and he kind of broke down the gauntlet of a lot of different stuff. So I'm always impressed with the stuff he does, so I like to present it to you guys, and you'll see that on Tuesday. All right? Have a good weekend.